Learning and assessment go hand in hand. That being said, assessment can often become a quality cop type format, where somebody's in trouble if they didn't do something right, where going to the learning department is going to the principal's office. We need to figure out ways to balance between, is it a learning problem or is it a quality cop issue? So the quality cop classic is the person walking down the halls with a clipboard in hands checking off did somebody do something right or wrong. That feels like a test. What happens then is people start acting differently. We use that hand washing example. Once everybody knows somebody's watching, you'll see people walking out, I'm washing my hands, you see? Because they're trying to pass the test. What happens when we're talking about passing the test, the question is, does the test actually matter? You know, there are some things, a pre-operative checklist, for example, that there's a test that matters. You have to do certain steps in certain order, and it matters. But that's not a learning problem. That is just making sure you're adhering to a checklist. There are other things where the tests don't matter. For example, people often use pre-post tests. Now, pre-post tests measure knowledge. Well, if we look at the Joint Commission regulations and most other areas, they're looking at competency, which is not measured by a multiple choice pre-post test. I was working with one group and there was 5-question pre-post test, and I said, well, what happens if somebody fails? I said, well, nothing. Okay. And what happens if they pass? Nothing. Okay. What do you do with the results? Nothing. Well, I review them to make sure that they learned something. What we found is actually it made the educator feel good that somebody went from a 60 to an 80. But that doesn't impact the patient. That doesn't impact learning. We need to be shifting so that if any assessment we do is related to the patient and has an impact on learning. So for example, in simulation, you might use it for fitness for duty. We used it when somebody has had a mental or physical incapacity to see if they can do the job. That's a good place for simulation. But we also need to make sure the test is psychometrically sound and valid. To make sure that if we're going to make a high stakes decision, that the test is valid, is not discriminating, and is designed in an appropriate way. That's what a psychometrician for. It's somebody who tests for a living. When people say, well, I use such a test, my next question is, well, who's your psychometrician? And they go, huh? Just because a group sat around and worked on a set of questions does not make it valid. The other part of it is, if it's going to end up in an employment decision, now we're talking about discriminatory and other considerations that will fit in there and we'll see in legal cases. We need to make sure that we're using assessment at the right place. So the first test I usually use is, well, why do I have the assessment? Is it actually helping me to validate competency, and does it frankly help the patient? Most multiple choice tests will not pass that. So what ends up happening is we need to think about it differently. I'll give you an example. So very commonly, reading EKG rhythms is a test. Well, EKGs on a multiple choice test are completely different than real life. The actual way to review competency would be to do a chart review to look at and see, are people actually getting the rhythms appropriately documented based on the strips? And you can do that in a peer review process so that peers can actually give each other feedback, which is then formative and provides structure. That is something also that will positively impact the patient. Whether or not somebody gets a 60 or an 80 on a rhythm test does not impact the patient, because they can get 100 on the rhythm test but still get them wrong in real life. We need to make sure in learning that we're seen as people helping people to get better, even though we may be testing them. To do that, we want to make sure we set a safe environment and split days. You know, if somebody is being tested, ideally it should not be the same day as they're learning, because the answers I give you in a debriefing, informative approach, or in a test will be different. We also want to set a safe environment for both. So people that are being tested on competency should know what the competency is and how they're being tested. What happens is, as we start shifting away from multiple choice tests, we start shifting towards competency-based, can you do it? You see more simulation, more at the bedside assessments. You're going to start seeing better measurements that actually have true feedback for people to make improvements, which is a learning approach rather than a quality cop approach.